Hebrews 11, verses 1 to 12. If you're using one of our worship Bibles, page 974. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offering. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith, Noah was warned about things not yet seen. In holy fear, built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteous that is in keeping with faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children, because she considered him faithful who made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and as countless as the sand on the seashore. This is the word of the Lord. We are all familiar, I think, with the idea that 1 Corinthians 13 is titled the love chapter. Not biblically titled that, but we call it that. It's been nicknamed that over the years. There's another chapter in the Bible that has a special name, and that is Hebrews 11, which is referred to as the faith chapter. That is the chapter from which I read verses 1 to 11 just a few moments ago, and you can see why it's called the faith chapter. It does continue on in that same vein of thought for the next, pretty much for most of the chapter. I'm going to skip about 10 verses or so and pick up reading there again in verse 23 and read to the end of the chapter. Hebrews 11, verses 23 to the end of the chapter. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood, and so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released, so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskin and goatskin, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us they be made perfect. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
And so this writer has gone through this catalog of Old Testament characters and talked about some of the things they faced. Some of it, we have legends that have passed down over the generations that didn't even get written down in the Bible. And this author references even those. And so we have all of these stories about people of great faith and how they were commended for their faith and how important their faith was. And as awesome as that was, it kind of pointed out that there was something more that they still didn't get. And then the author's telling them, but now the time has come. That it was going to be combined with us is when they would receive the fullness of the promise. And of course he was talking about Jesus Christ, who finally came, who finally died on a cross for us, who was finally resurrected, and that changed everything. Now, all of these characters who had faith and who lived it out, who faced torture and persecution, some of them were martyred, now they're going to receive that promise. It's going to be truly fulfilled, and their faith will have proven to pan out. So what I want to do is kind of keeping that background, of course. I want to move on to chapter 12, and we're going to look at just the first 3 verses today for the main topic today. So Hebrews 12, verse 1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. That's always one of those favorite verses for some people. It's one of those passages that kids and teens are often encouraged to memorize when they're doing memory work and all of those things. Some great lessons there. And I want to point out just a few things about this verse before we move on to the next couple. First of all, I want you to notice that phrase, such a great cloud of witnesses. He is referring, of course, to that list that we've just gone through. All of those people that he talked about and brought up and mentioned, and of course the ones that he was thinking about that he didn't mention, he doesn't have time. And he gives an example of some of the ones he doesn't have time to talk about. But of course there are more and more and more of those. And so he says, there are a great cloud of witnesses. And in thinking about what that really means, it turns out that there's kind of a double meaning going on. This is a great cloud of witnesses in more than one way. So the first sense is there are witnesses in the sense of they are those who testify. So you think about a court trial, and you think about a lawyer saying, I'm going to call my first witness. They are witnesses in that respect. They have seen God's faith, and they have seen their faith in action. They have seen what God can accomplish. They have seen how God helped them and carried them through. And of course, we can say, well, it says this guy got sawn in two. How was God with him? Well, God was with him while he was being sawn in two. and he was able to persevere through that. And of course, now that Jesus has come and died and resurrected, that's his future, that's his present. And so that is how his faith in God comes through there. And so you've got all of these people. You can say, well, you know, is faith in God real? Does our faith worthwhile? Does our faith pay off? And all of these witnesses in chapter 11 say yes. They are witnesses in that kind of way. But in this context, they're also witnesses in the context of they are those who spectate and cheer us on. So he's also talking about the idea that all of us are in the race. We are all involved in that same life journey that they were involved in. And we all have different things. You know, all of those people had different stories. Abel's story was not the same as Noah's story, which was not the same as Gideon's story. They all had different circumstances. They all had different times and places. They all had different things happening to them. And God was faithful in his own way through all of those. And so we are next in line. We are taking part in that same journey as we live our lives following after Christ. We too face hardships and trouble and persecutions. And, you know, we happen to live in America where the kind of persecution that we get for being Christians is not anywhere near the kind of persecution that other people get for being Christians. Our persecution is, you know, we get made fun of sometimes. We lose a promotion because we refuse to cheat. You know, we get some of those kinds of things happen to us. But there are other places in the world today in which you can be beaten and killed because you're a Christian. And so we're on this journey. And all of those who came before are watching us. And they're like not just casual observers, but they're kind of like our fans. They're like the cheering section. They're this great cloud of witnesses encouraging and watching. And, you know, so people sometimes talk about, you know, the people in heaven, can they see us? And like in the movies, they always talk, oh yeah, they're watching us. But you know, that's not unchristian. Unlike a lot of what Hollywood has to say about religion and God, that happens to be kind of biblical. That those who have gone on before us are watching. And they can see us. And there are our great cloud of witnesses in front of whom we are performing, so to speak. And so that's what the writer here means by this great cloud of witnesses. They are those who have gone before and witnessed to God's faith themselves, and they are now our spectators watching us go on. So then there's that word therefore that this verse began with. Therefore. And of course, that is referring to because of all of the stories he told in chapter 11. Because of everything he told us in chapter 11, here comes the implication, therefore, and we have another double meaning. And maybe double significance would have been a better way of saying it here, but I wanted to follow up on the double meaning of the last screen. So another double meaning. And so one of those is, let's follow their examples. You know, let's be like them. They had faith right up until some of them were killed. They kept the faith. They persevered through it all. They didn't abandon God and turn their back on Him. They kept the faith. Let's be like them. Let's follow their examples and persevere, no matter what it is that we face, no matter how outlandish. You know, and we were reminded of the Noah story, and we are all familiar with that. And you know, we've seen a few sprinkly raindrops today. We are familiar with rain, and we've been talking about floods this week. You know, the last couple I've been talking about you know, the Kentucky floods a lot, and we are familiar with that. Think back biblically, Noah. Those people were unfamiliar with rain. I did something.
Oh, that was a quick sermon.
So, but Noah wasn't. And yet he was told this is what's going to happen. So he built an ark. Now think about the faith that would require. All of the hardship and how hard the work is to build the ark to start with, how difficult that is, and he's doing it for some purpose that he's completely unfamiliar with, because God told him to. That is an exercise of faith. And so that's one of those examples, and we're being told here, we have this great cloud of witnesses, we need to follow their examples. We need to be like them. And the other way this is supposed to have significance to us is let them motivate us. As they cheer us on and keep us going. A lot of people love to watch a lot of basketball and baseball and football on TV, and that has never really been my cup of tea. I watch Packer games only, and I don't always watch them. But there are other less popular sports that I really enjoy watching on TV. If there's a televised marathon on TV, I will often watch it. And people say, "What? You watch these people run for 2 hours?" And I enjoy that, and I watch it. But one of the things that I remember going to, like a high school cross-country meet. How many of you have been to a high school cross-country meet? A couple of you. So I would go to one of those, and one of the things that I noticed that happens in those kinds of track meets, cross-country and in regular track, the 2 mile, for example, is there are people who push themselves almost too far. They run faster than they should have for the first 2 miles, and then they are running out of steam in the 3rd mile. And there will be people along the course, there will be people standing there who cheer them on, not in the sense of like great home run, great basket. There'll be people who you can do it. Keep it up, you can finish. And they'll encourage them to keep going. And that is the simple motivating factor. Some of them will get to the end and say that, and they'll be marathon runners, this 60-year-old grandmother of 2 who had, a broken leg 3 years ago and was told she couldn't run. She's running this, and they will interview her on TV because of who she is. How did you manage to finish this? And she said, I almost gave up. And on the 22nd mile, I was about to stop and give up, and there were some people on the side of the road yelling and screaming at me to keep going. And that kept me going. And that's how I was able to finish. And so this writer is talking about all of those who have gone before us doing that for us. Let them serve as motivators. They're on our side. They're cheering for us. They're wanting us to make it. And so we should plow ahead because of what they do. So then the author here gives us some suggestions as to how it is that we're going to successfully make this race. Besides letting them motivate us and cheer us on, this great cloud of witnesses that's watching, he says, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that entangles, so easily entangles. And there's 2 sections here. The idea of throw off everything that hinders. Some of the scholars are agreed that because of the way this is constructed and the fact that this talks about those things that hinder and sins that easily entangle, that there are two different categories. The first one being anything that hinders. And they say the reality is, what makes this different is it includes things that are good stuff. Things that hinder us aren't necessarily sins. Think about that for a minute. There are things in your life that's not sinful. There's nothing wrong with it inherently. They're perfectly fine. But in your particular journey, in your circumstance, they might hinder you from taking the path you're supposed to be taking. They might slow you down. They might interrupt your journey. And so he's telling us, even if it's not sin, even if it's a good thing, if it's something that's going to hinder your Christian journey, give it up. Throw it off. And so you picture, again, the modern athlete, well, the ancient athletes were even, we think about modesty and stuff, how bad it's getting in our world. In the ancient Olympics, they performed nude. I mean, they were even less modest. But now, if you watch the races, they don't wear much. You see marathon runners, they wear very little because they want to have as few things discrediting them or slowing them down as possibly can. And you think about like the Tour de France. They will work on their bikes and they will do things and they will change components. They will do this, that, and the other. And oh, we got these new pedals that we added, and we just saved ourselves 1.5 grams. And because they're interested in saving that little, they want to throw up everything that hinders, so that to keep them faster. And so he's telling us to do that. And then, of course, the sins that entangles. Obviously, if there's something in our life that's actually a sin, we need to throw those off. That goes without saying too. I read a story when I was a kid about it was called Big Swat, and that was this guy's nickname. He was a high school athlete, and he was nicknamed Big SWAT. And he was so much bigger and stronger than most other high school students that like when it was time to like train, the coach would have him have to do special things. It's like they're going to run the 1/4 mile, and to kind of keep it competitive with the other students, Big SWAT had to carry a couple of shot put with him. So those are like, in high school, 12-pound balls. And so he's going to have a 12-pound ball in each hand as he runs the 1/4 mile to keep it fair to everybody else. Well, can you imagine trying to compete at your best and run a 1/4 mile carrying 12-pound balls in your hands? That's kind of what it's like to try to do the Christian journey with sin in your life. It's just absurd to think about. Obviously, you want to cast those things off. So for most of us, while it might be hard to do, it's easy to understand that we need to throw off the sin that would entangle us. The harder one for us might be those things that hinder. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, nothing's wrong with that, but it's hindering you. Maybe God is calling you to do something in your life, and you just don't have time. And there's other things that you have in your life, there's nothing wrong with it, except that it's taking up time. And God wants you to free up that time for this new mission or thing. So throwing off the things that hinder is an important part of this. We are told to run with perseverance. And obviously, most of us know enough about sports to know that the way you approach running a mile, the way you approach running 100 yards or 100 meters, the way you approach running a marathon are very different approaches. When it's the 100 meters, the gun goes off and you're going to run as fast as you possibly can until you cross the tape. And if it's the 200 meter, you're going to try to do the same thing. You might ease up a little bit for that first 70 yards or so, but then you're just going to go flat out as fast as you can. You're going to run the 400 meter. Well, now you got to hold back a little because your body, it just will not let you run flat out for that far. You just can't do that. So you've got to pace yourself a little bit. If you're going to run 26 miles, obviously you have to pace yourself even more. Your body you can't go 100 meters speed for 26 miles. It just doesn't work that way. We are told to run with perseverance. We need to think in terms of long term. We need to think in terms of getting it done and being steady and being continuously faithful and not just thinking I can get through this tomorrow, but I need a plan that's going to last me for the rest of my life. And that's what brings us into, Robin mentioned this morning, hopefully, you have your Bible time in the morning, that kind of thing. Those are the things that help you run with perseverance. Those Christian things like, praying and Bible reading and devotions and and attending worship with the church family, going to Bible studies. All of those things are things that helps us run with perseverance rather than just making it. And he says we have to run the race marked out for us. And this is where we get into that what I was talking about earlier, where like Abel's story was different from Noah's story, different from Gideon's story. We all have a race marked out for us. And that race looks a little different for all of us. Normally, like in the marathon, everybody's going to run the same course. But in reality, in our lives, we all have a slightly different course. We have the same destination. You know, we want to be pleasing God and living for Him and hitting eternity and going to heaven and all of those kinds of things. But the way we get there is different for all of us. You know, my journey, being called to change majors and begin to prepare for ministry and going to seminary and then pastoring, most of you weren't called to do it that way. But you do have your calling. What does God want you to do? And you have to run that faithfully. And don't try to run someone else's race. Run your race. And that becomes important. But make sure you run the race the way it's marked out. Don't try. I had a high school friend whose nickname was Cutter. And actually, it had been his brother's nickname. And so they just kind of attached it to him unfairly. But the reason that his brother was called Cutter was because he cheated in cross country. Think about that as your nickname. You are known as being a cheater. Don't try to cut. Don't try to take shortcuts in this journey like Cutter did. Run the race that's marked out for you. I want to move on to 12:2, the first part of that. After telling us to run with perseverance the race marked out for us, in 2a he says to fix your eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. So he's telling us, in spite of all those example witnesses that we've talked about, in spite of all those chapter 11 people, Jesus is the one whom we should really fix our eyes on. You know, we see them, we watch them, we're aware of them, we let them encourage us, let them cheer us on, but the one that we really fix our eyes on, the one that we lock into and stay locked into, is Jesus. Because Jesus is the pioneer and perfecter of faith. That idea of the pioneer and the perfecter, that's another way of saying the starter and the finisher, or the launcher and the bring to completioner. Jesus is the one who gives us faith. Jesus initiates faith. And Jesus is the one who brings it to completion. He's the one who fulfills it. He gave us the promise. He fulfills the promise. And so, according to verse 3, he says, consider him who endured such opposition from sinners. And so we get the idea that Jesus had it worse than anyone. And he didn't deserve it. So here's the guy who doesn't deserve anything bad to happen to him. And he's the guy who had all these people turn against him and all the way up to crucifixion on a cross. He's the supreme example. He's the bigger example than all of those. Keeping in the sports mode, I want to show you another picture. This is a picture of a group of about half a dozen or so guys who are considered to be, the day this picture was taken, the greatest athletes in the world. They don't look like it here. Here's a bunch of guys laying on the ground. They have absolutely collapsed. And if you look at the picture, you can see they have barely crossed the finish line. Those markings behind them on the ground, that was the finish line. They crossed the finish line and dropped to the ground. It wasn't a long race. This was only 100 meters. You can see the starting blocks way in the background. And I'm doing it again. I'm pointing at my screen. You guys are looking at that screen. But what this photo doesn't show This was actually event 10 of the decathlon. So they've had 2 days in which they've competed in 10 events. They've just finished event number 10, crossed the line, and they have given every ounce of energy they have. They have nothing left. They put it all on the table, nothing left in reserve. In the previous event, they had to leave something in reserve so they could run the 100 meters. But now they're used up, they cross the line, they just collapse there. You know, in most races, you watch it on TV, they finish the race, and they trot around and do the victory lap and all of that. After the decathlon, they are done. They are exhausted. Aristotle, millennium ago, describing this factor, describing athletes crossing the finish line and hitting the ground, that collapse, he used the same Greek words that the writer of the Hebrew used here when he said, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. The verbs for grow weary and lose heart is what Aristotle described as these athletes hitting the ground at the end of the race. So that's the picture. And the writer is telling us that if we will keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, following his example, that we can run this journey that we're on and not grow weary and lose heart. That we won't end up a pile on the ground at the finish line. That we can continue to race, that we can continue to move on. And so that is what this whole passage is calling us to do. We are on this life's journey. We are facing all the different kinds of troubles and hardships. All those chapter 11 people face different versions of it, but we have our own versions of it. And he's telling us, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, and you will not grow weary and lose heart. You will be able to make it through to the end. Let's pray.